The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP aims to improve the quality of reporting on Africa-China relations through reporting grants, workshops, and other opportunities for journalists. More information at africachinareporting.co.za and our dedicated training website at africachinatraining.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, before we get to our discussion today about the Bagamoyo port in Tanzania, I think it's really important for us to start our discussion for the dramatic events that have been happening in Johannesburg and around South Africa. You wrote about it today for our newsletter to give some perspective, a very personal story. It doesn't really have anything to do with China, but given that the fact that you are in Johannesburg, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing right now in the dramatic events that have been unfolding there over the past few days.
So South Africa at the moment is going through a very, very steep COVID wave, and also there's been a long dragging on kind of dispute between the current administration and the previous administration, particularly its leader Jacob Zuma. So they recently managed to kind of get a charge. Jacob Zuma has a very long legacy of really crazy corruption, and so there's been many kind of trials and processes and commissions of inquiry to try and kind of get him on the hook for some of this corruption, and he was refusing to show up to these hearings. So he was now recently kind of imprisoned for contempt of court, and then as a kind of result, he has significant support in certain areas of the country. So there's been some protests, and then I think the protests have been really exacerbated by COVID and the kind of economic kind of crash because of COVID. So that has now, like yesterday and today, is really kind of switched over into kind of crazy looting. So there's, so it looks like in some of the province there might be the army is probably going to be brought in, and it's this weird moment where it's simultaneously, a really serious kind of COVID spike, and yet people are kind of out, kind of really endangering their lives, and increasingly are now going to get in, kind of in fights with the police. We're guessing. So it's a little kind of hairy at the moment.
And technically, you guys are on a lockdown, supposedly, right?
Yes.
Yeah, just like us out here in Vietnam. Well, we hope that you stay safe and things calm down. Let's turn our attention now to the Bagamoyo port deal. This is a story that we've talked about on a couple previous podcasts, but really it comes up to on June 26th. There was a speech, and there she is in the background, Tanzanian President Hassan. She took everybody by surprise on June 26th at a meeting of the Tanzanian National Business Council, where she announced that talks with China Merchant Holdings have resumed to expand the port project in Bagamoyo. Now, this is a project that dates all the way back to 2013, when the government signed a framework agreement with the China Merchant Holdings International Company and Oman's State General Reserve Fund to build both a port and a special economic zone. Now, the whole project came to a crashing, dramatic, explosive end back in 2019 when late President John Magufuli famously shut it down when he said, and used these great quotes, and Magufuli, if his legacy is nothing else than some of his very colorful quotes, only a drunkard would accept the terms set by China merchants. He called the deal exploitative, and then he came back with a very tough counteroffer. He wanted, instead of a 99-year lease, he said that they'll get a 33-year lease. He said there will be no tax holidays. China merchants will not be granted any special status and will be required to pay market rates for water and electricity, just like any other investor. He also said that China merchants will not be allowed to run any other businesses within the port without the government's permission, and that the government will retain the right to develop other ports if it wants. So you can see in some of those terms the hallmarks of the very tough contractual terms that Chinese companies and the Chinese policy banks have built a reputation for in Africa, that these are deals that are very, very weighted in China's favors. President Magufuli said, nope, not going to do it. That effectively brought the talks to an end back in 2019. And since 2019, we haven't heard much. Right after that, though, China's critics, man, they just pounced. And they said, this is a great example of how developing countries are pushing back on the Belt and Road. You heard a lot of talk in the US and Europe saying, aha, you see, this is agency in action. We're pushing back on the Belt and Road, on the China and these onerous terms. Well, that really wasn't quite the case. It was just the fact that Magufuli wanted a better deal. Doesn't mean he didn't want to do the port deal. He just wanted better terms. Now, let's fast forward to 2021 at the speech that at the Tanzania National Business Council that President Hassan gave. It really took a lot of us by surprise because we have not seen any indication that the Bagamoyo deal was back on the table again, or that was something that was warming up. And then a couple days after her speech, in The Citizen, which is one of the national newspapers, I think it's owned by the Nation Media Group in Kenya, so it's not a government paper, there was this very interesting article that only had anonymous sources, and it was clearly trying to guide the conversation away from some of the potholes that derailed it earlier. So, number one, these sources, and again, I don't know who they are, nobody knows who they are, but they raise some very interesting points. Number one, this is not a Chinese project. That's one of the points that these anonymous sources wanted to make. The Bagamoyo Port Project is the brainchild of the Tanzania Ports Authority through its Tanzania Port Development Master Plan, which runs from 2009 to 2028. So a lot of people misperceive this to be part of the Chinese wanting to do this, when in fact, according to these sources, it's not. It's been a plan all along. This is not a debt-funded project. This is going to be an investor-led project. So the $10 billion number that has been widely circulated around this project is not $10 billion in debt. It is going to be underwritten by investors like Oman and their sovereign wealth fund, as well as China Merchant Holdings. So Tanzania will not take on a lot of debt, according to these sources. We're going to find out more today if that's in fact the case. Cobus, after this came out, I wrote a column on this saying, hey, everybody, it's great that Tanzania wants to negotiate, but 2019 is nothing like 2021. China is really out of the big infrastructure business in Africa today. It has been a long time since we have seen an announcement of the Chinese either funding or underwriting or investing in a major project. Last one was the Lekki port in Nigeria that I think is China Merchant is also building there. That's a public-private partnership deal. But the days of them building these massive infrastructure projects using the policy banks are over. Also, let's bear in mind, there are a lot of ports now on the eastern shore of Africa. Let's just kind of start at the top and go to the bottom. You've got the port of Djibouti. You've got the port of Somaliland now. Dar es Salaam, port of Mombasa, now the new Lamu port that the Chinese are expanding. Port of Durban, Cobus in your neighborhood in South Africa. That's a lot of competition. Do we need another major deep sea port? So Cobus, Xi may want to get back in the game. There's no guarantee that the Chinese are in the mood to talk.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question is who was involved in the original kind of negotiations would be coming back for the new bout. China Merchants is a massive port company. That's this one question mark. The other one is Omani Capital was also talked about in the earlier deal. We're also not sure what that means. The other, I think, as you say, the bigger question is how is this port going to differentiate itself between the other ports? And what is its business plan? Beyond simply we're going to have a massive port. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this kind of unfolds.
Well, let's get two perspectives on this story. It's a fascinating story. It's much more complicated than what you're reading in the paper. So we thought, let's do a deep dive and get two experts who've been following this very closely. First, Thabit Jacob is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Political Science at the University of Gothenberg and joins us from Sweden. A very good morning to you, Thabit.
Good morning.
And we're also joined on the line from Muhidin Shangwe, who's back on the show. Muhidin is a lecturer in the Political Science Department at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. A very good morning to you, Muhidin.
Good morning, Eric.
Okay, Thabit, let's start with you. I kind of set it up. I hope I got all my facts straight. I think before we go too much down the road, can you give us a little bit of a background on the port, things that I didn't say, kind of what was the motivation? Why is this port so important? And what was Magufuli's intention in terms of bringing it to an end? And why would Hassan kind of want to bring it back? Give us an overview of how you see the situation. And Muhidin, then we'll come to you.
Right. So, I mean, as you said, the port idea was the brainchild of the former president, Jakaya Kikwete. He was in a tour in Malaysia back in the 2010. And, he came back and then the government sort of came up with the so-called Tanzania Main Tiger project, kind of like trying to mirror what happened in South Korea and Taiwan and Malaysia. And this is how the whole idea of the port came in. But as you said, President Magufuli came in at the end of 2015, and he was very skeptical about the terms of the, not just the port, but, he was really skeptical of the 10 years of President Kikwete. And you could say that some of these skepticism were kind of justified because the 10 years of President Kikwete were, marked by a series of corruption scandals, especially in the energy sector. There were also a lot of generous terms for mining and energy companies. And, as we all know, Magufuli came in and then in 2017 started this big battle with the Canadian miner, Acacia. And as you said, he was hailed as the kind of like the new deal maker in Africa, the kind of leader that the continent needs. And it wasn't a surprise that in 2019, he said the whole thing is not going to happen because, the terms are very much unfair to Tanzania. And again, as I've said, very much questionable terms, things that President Kikwete was pushing ahead. I should also say that, for some people, this was also seen by people in Tanzania as a way of President Kikwete giving something back to people from his own backyard because, Bagamoyo is very close to where he was born. But moving forward, as you said, the recent announcement by President Hassan has caught everybody by surprise. I wasn't really surprised. I think there are a couple of reasons for that as to why she has all of a sudden revived the port. I think number one is that President Hassan is trying to send a message to the rest of the world that she's trying to move beyond rhetoric. She has recently promised quite a lot of things, making Tanzania the best investment destination again, improving the business climate and all that. And I think she's trying to say that she's moving beyond rhetoric. And to be fair, she has already proven that. She has recently normalized trade relationship with Kenya. Just before Magufuli died, Kenya and Tanzania were caught in a very nasty trade war. So at least things are back to normal now. She has hosted Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest man. She has recently hosted the head of the IMF, the head of the African Free Trade Area. So I think she's trying to send a message that she's moving from rhetoric to, getting things done. But the most important thing, I think, is she also wants to show that she can get things done on her own, because I think we have to be careful that she'll be running again for another term back in 2025. And I think she wants to show that she needs to have her own project to show that she can get things done. And she's not just riding on Magufuli's project. So this is why we also saw she has asked the Minister of Energy to fast track the $30 billion LNG project, which is stalled for 6-7 years. She has also asked the Minister of Mining to fast track another project, which actually involves Chinese investment, the Ligangam Chuchuma coal and iron project. I think this is very important because she knows that come 2025, she'll be out campaigning and she'll need to show that she can also show that in a couple of projects that she can get things done on her own. And also this is in a country where some people are still very skeptical for female president, whether she can get things done or not.
Yeah, Muhidin, let's get your opening take on this.
Building from what Thabit was talking about is the domestic context of all this discussion rather than just China. So Thabit is right when he's talking about when President Samia came into office, Magufuli saw the need kind of to push back against his predecessor, and I would say President Samia Suluhu is also finding the necessity to also kind of push back against her predecessor, that is Magufuli. So there's more happening in terms of domestic politics before we talk about China. And I think President Samia Suluhu has shown or has demonstrated that the kind of direction that she wants to take. And she has said it emphatically that she's going to open up the country. And just by saying that, you start imagining that the Chinese capital is going to have a very important role to play in that regard. So many people say it was by surprise, but I don't think it was that surprising. Like for me, I wasn't really surprised because according to anonymous source, for example, President Xi Jinping made a phone call in December, had a phone call conversation with the late President Magufuli. And then in January this year, there was an official visit by the Chinese foreign minister. And I heard, or I'm told, that the Bagamoyo port agenda was discussed. And according to this source, is that there was positive signs shown by the Tanzanian side. And then you fast track that in June this year, where President Xi Jinping again had a phone conversation with President Samia Suluhu. And then immediately after that, the Tanzanian president revealed that they have started the discussion about the Bagamoyo port project. And before that, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, like the business community here in Tanzania, met the President Samia Suluhu, and they had a discussion. And if you want to read from those discussions, there was a clear indication of what was going to happen with regard to Bagamoyo. There was a lot of mentioning about the Belt and Road Initiative. And once you mention that, obviously the Bagamoyo port comes into your mind. So I just wanted to emphasize Thabit's point that a lot that has happened has to do with domestic politics before we talk about China, just as the project itself that it was initiated domestically before the Chinese came in and sort of get involved in the project.
Thabit, what is the business case for the Bagamoyo port? Like, do they expect it's going to compete with Lamu, for example? Do they have a plan for that kind of competition? Or and how much do you feel is sound business thinking about the sustainability of the port project itself, and how much is kind of driven by competition with Kenya and competition with Djibouti and try that kind of what we've seen in other cases, sometimes in East Africa, where different countries end up kind of replicating each other's capability.
Right. As Eric was saying, is that the key question first of all is the competition, because you've got the United Arab Emirates has just put up an upgraded huge container ports in Somaliland, and we know that the Chinese are involved in the Lamu project, which is going to connect all the way to southern Sudan and Ethiopia. And I should say that when President Magufuli announced in 2019 that Bagamoyo port was off the radar, if you look at the 5 years development, the Tanzania National 5 years development plan, so much effort has gone into upgrading the Mtwara port. This is another port in southern Tanzania, and the Tanga port. This is northern Tanzania, where the Ugandan oil will pass through. So the big question, for the proponents of the Bagamoyo port, the story is that first of all the physical condition, that this is the port that is got it can host bigger ships than the port of Dar es Salaam because it sits on deep water. There's also the story that if it's completed, if you assume this project gets done, by 2025, it could handle up to 20 million containers annually, which is perhaps 25 times the port of Dar es Salaam. So there is a little bit of a business case, but I think if you look at the competition around, especially, I should say also Mombasa port is going through a lot of upgrading at the moment and expansion. And Mombasa is already busier than Dar es Salaam. So I think there are two things here. I think Eric has pointed out, first of all, is there an appetite from the Chinese side? So Muhidin suggests that maybe there's kind of an appetite. There is an appetite from the Chinese side and the Omanis perhaps. But the big question is, the regional competition is really intense because the Barbera port in Somaliland is getting busy. Mombasa is going through expansion. There's a couple of expansions in Mtwara and Tanga, as I have said. And I think, if you ask me, I think the business case is really questionable at the moment.
Muhidin, listening to what Thabit was saying about the questionable business case, it brings me back to the standard gauge railway development in Kenya, when they inflated all of these numbers saying they're going to have massive amounts of port to rail traffic, and that kind of justified it. And in many ways, so we've heard, that prompted a new religion in the China Exim Bank and with Chinese state-owned enterprises on really having solid feasibility studies done on these projects to make sure there is a path to revenue. But when I hear all of this talk about massive amount of cargo, we are literally embarking on an economic period now for at least the next decade, in my view. And again, I'm not an economist, but Africa is being set back years now because of the crisis brought on by COVID-19 that's led into a financial crisis. So if those high-flying economic kind of projections that they had maybe 5-6 years ago or 10 years ago, they have to be rolled back today in the current climate. So in the current climate, let's pick up on the conversation with Thabit. Do you think there is a business case to be made? Is there a feasibility study that can justify a massive multi-billion-dollar port in the current era that we're living in?
You're very right to raise concern on this matter regarding the economic feasibility of the project. And it remains to be very curious to see how the pandemic, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, is going to affect the initial planning. And as you rightly pointed out in the beginning, the project was announced 8 years ago, and a lot has happened in between, including the latest the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it's going to be it's going to affect the whole architecture of negotiation and the deal itself. But also, I think it's important to be mindful that the Bagamoyo Port project is not just about the port, because from what we have learned is that there are going to be an industrial park and kind of creating a logistic hub in the region. And how that now, Thabit and you, Eric, were talking about the regional competition and whether that is going to complement other regional projects that are going on where the Chinese have interest, for example, the Lamu Port project, and always going to be inconsistent with the Bagamoyo Port project. Now, that remains to be seen, but I want to believe that it's going to be very difficult, and the negotiations now are going to take a whole new turn, and it's not about going back to where they left off. Probably they'll have to go back to drawing board and try to come up with a business plan, and which is going to affect the nature of the project, I'm sure. So now it's difficult to tell, but I think it's obvious that a lot is going to be changed in terms of what the deal is about, the details of the project, due to what has transpired in the past few years, particularly with regard to the coronavirus pandemic. And we know that, for example, when the project is stalled, we are aware that the Chinese turned their interest in Djibouti, and therefore I think there's a legitimate question here whether they're still going to get involved in a way that they thought they would get involved in the probably 5 years ago. So it's curious. It's difficult to tell right now, but I'm sure all these factors that we have talked about are going to affect the nature of the deal, and I don't know what's going to transpire in the end, but yeah, it means to be very curious.
Just before we go on much further, let me just emphasize again that we talk about the port, but the port is only one part of a much bigger what they're calling the Special Economic Zone Master Plan that includes a logistics park, a tourist park, a residential area. There's a commercial zone, an information communications technology park, an area for small to medium-sized enterprises, the industrial zone that Muhidin talked about, and then the port. Cobus, we've seen over the years a lot of these big special economic zone master plans throughout Africa. Most have not been very successful. And so I'm just kind of wondering, Cobus, what's your take on whether or not this is a good idea in your view to kind of build a diversified, in the current economic climate, based on what we know on the performance of other special economic zones around Africa, including some in South Africa?
Yeah, there's generally a pretty mixed record. We have seen some successes in Ethiopia, for example, and in some of these kind of developments in South Africa. But frequently they depend very much on having a specific industry or specific kind of point of view, and it'll be very interesting to see which specific industries are expected to be developed by the special economic zone in Tanzania. The question, the $1 million question then becomes kind of which other Chinese companies are involved. So in Ethiopia is a classic example where Chinese companies drove a kind of a development of an entire Ethiopian kind of garment assembly sector, which kind of like roughly on the lines of a country like Bangladesh. So it'll be very interesting to see if any of that, if any kind of targeted kind of industries are being kind of identified at the moment. Thabit, do you have any idea of what the specific kind of plans are for the different sections of the special economic zone?
No, I think what we know is that, again, the special economic zones goes way back to the days of President Mkapa, actually. So you're talking about pre-2005 backwards, and then they took over when President Kikwete came in. But again, President Magufuli was very skeptical about economic zones. He thought some of the terms that were offered by these exporters were very too generous. So again, these are the things that, as Shangwe was pointing out, that President Samia is very keen to undo some of the Magufuli's way of doing things. Maybe this is one of it, because if you were to take the port as part of the special economic zones, then the thinking and the strategies really have to change, because President Magufuli was not such a fan of special economic zones. And I think now what the president has done, she has appointed people who are kind of known to be, so the current Minister of Investment, for instance, used to be the head of the National Investment Center, so he knows his stuff. But I think there'll be a lot of re-strategizing, a lot of rethinking if you were to make the port as part of the economic zones, because I think the whole story of Tanzania special economic zones has been a failure, to be honest.
Yeah, no, that's what we've seen in a number of different countries as well. Not some of them work, as Cobus pointed out, but quite a few don't. Muhidin, let's go back to what you were talking about earlier with the visit in January of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And when he came to Tanzania, one of the things that he did, in fact, the highlight of his visit, was to sign a $1.3 billion contract for Chinese companies to build Phase 5 of Tanzania's new standard gauge railway. Now, very interesting, in contrast to what happened in Kenya, where Chinese policy banks, the China Exim Bank, financed the development of that railway. Instead, these railways in Tanzania are being financed by Tanzania itself, and not by the Chinese, but Chinese contractors are building it. So let's bring up the question of the standard gauge railway. Does the SGR, when it eventually comes, play a part in what's happening in Bagamoyo?
Yeah, yes, Eric. I think that was part of the original idea, was to, for example, talk about a transport or a logistic hub, Bagamoyo being a logistic hub or a transport hub for the region. And you can do that until you have a network of roads and railways that open up the region, and SGR is part and parcel of that original idea. You talk about the funding. The funding has been a problem because as it stands today, we know that the funding for Phase 3 and 4 has not been secured, and I think last time we talked, there was what we knew then, and it hasn't changed until today, was that the government was also talking to the Chinese Exim Bank to see if they could get a loan to finance the phase 3 and 4 of the SGR. But yes, the SGR falls into the original plan of Bagamoyo. And therefore, maybe this is what makes the Bagamoyo port, this project, a little maybe special, because you also have to take into consideration other factors. Tanzania tends to think that is special when it comes to its relationship with China, justifiably given the history between the two countries, but also given the sort of like the national attributes of Tanzania, the size of its population, but also the stability. And here, when I talk about stability, I'm not talking about both in terms of political stability, but also in terms of stability when it comes to who is in power. At least if things remain as they are in the foreseeable future, we don't see a regime change in terms of the ruling party in Tanzania, like another party winning an election, at least in the foreseeable future, if all things remain constant. So there's that kind of stability as well, which I think might interest the Chinese. But yeah, the regional influence historically, Tanzania, although the influence has been waning in recent years, but there's that element of, like, if you like, Tanzanian soft power in the region for countries such as Burundi and DRC and Mozambique and so forth, and Zambia, So it may be, if you take all these factors into consideration, probably that this is what makes Bagamoyo more kind of a special project if you compare it with other projects such as the Lamu project. I think that might, in a way, shape the nature of discussions about the project, but about the project itself.
Yeah, Cobus, listening to Muhidin, it's bringing me back to the conversation that you and I had with Professor Jonathan Fulton from Zayed University in the United Arab Emirates, when he talked about how the Chinese prize above almost anything is connectivity. And he used the example of Qatar, and this might be one of the areas that Tanzania does have an advantage, say, over Kenya and other East African countries, if they're able to get the standard gauge railway financed. I don't believe for a million years that the Chinese are going to pay for that after what they went through in Kenya. But if they are able to get that off the ground, because of their connectivity with the ports and in their, the relationship that they have with their neighbors and the ambitions that they have for their own rail network, that might be the motivation for Wang Yi and President Xi to engage the Tanzanians and want to get behind this thing. What do you think?
Quite possibly. I mean, we have to keep in mind that a significant proportion of, for example, like mineral exports from the DRC still run through Durban port in South Africa. So there's definitely space for like big logistics hubs.
I think it's
particularly.
Let me correct you. I think it's literally everything out of the DRC.
Really? Oh, it's very interesting.
There's no other port that I think is connected to the DRC. So that there is an opportunity there, particularly as cobalt and other electric vehicle battery raw materials demand is just going to skyrocket, to have some more ports that are accessible.
It's only the Lake Tanganyika port in Tanzania also connect through the ocean.
Yeah, so there's some opportunity on the lake side as well.
Yeah, so there's definitely kind of scope there, kind of for this kind of work. I guess the affordability and the logistics of it will determine a lot. Muhidin, I was wondering what you think of the geopolitical implications of this. Like we saw in the little bit of international reporting around the kind of revival of the deal, particularly in Nikkei Shimbun in Japan, that they were immediately starting to focus on geopolitical kind of implications. They immediately started raising the issue of the fact that obviously that Chinese kind of like Chinese warships are now are not able to dock at Djibouti, and research that earlier research that showed that Chinese commercial ports are also outfitted to be able to take kind of military vessels. And we already see both American and European, defense officials starting to kind of raise all of these concerns about the Indo-Pacific, and immediately jumping into debt trap rhetoric and so on. So I was wondering what you think of this kind of this discussion about the geopolitics of the development.
I think with regards to Djibouti, it's almost like designated by the Chinese for its military activities in Africa. And I don't think they'll like to do the same with Bagamoyo. So probably Bagamoyo is just going to be purely economics rather than military, sort of like making military inroads into Africa. So I don't think the Chinese will be interested in terms of making Bagamoyo also sort of like a port where you have Chinese naval ships, docking at Bagamoyo.
I mean, it's almost laughable a little bit. I mean, it's like American military fantasy that the Chinese are going to start building Navy ports all across Africa. I mean, there's no facts whatsoever to support any of that.
Exactly, Eric.
The story of, it goes back to the question of funding. So Shangwe, remember, this is something that really caught my attention, but I don't know, people haven't really talked much about this. In 2017, when Tanzania approached the Turkish Export Credit Bank, the state-owned Turkish bank, to finance the SGR. And I think Magufuli was on record. I think this was an interesting quote. I remember, Shangwe, you probably remember this, when he said that the Chinese of today are not the same the Chinese of the Tazara days.
Yes,
yeah, you remember he was basically trying to say that, because we had a very good deal with the Chinese back in the 70s, things have changed so much. And you have to approach China with cautious these days. You remember that, Chang? Maybe you could say a little bit more about it, because I thought that was very important.
Yes, and I think it was part of like demonstrating the breakaway from the past by the Magufuli administration. Because a lot of the narrative between the relationship between Tanzania and China, there's a lot about history, about what happened in the past. But also, we also know that the circumstances have changed in terms of, I think Magufuli was right when he said the Chinese of today are not the Chinese of the past. But also, I want to believe the Tanzanians of today are not the Tanzanians of the past. So it was more of like breaking away from the past by trying to come up with a different strategy to engage this new China, and I think this marks the new beginning in terms of the relationship between the two countries, which is more of economic driven rather than political driven in terms of ideology and third worldism, and China being the leader of the third world country, and Tanzania being this pan-Africanist country supporting liberation and so forth. So this, I think, marks the new beginning going forward, where economics becomes paramount as opposed to political as opposed to politics. That's to say.
And the China of 2021 is not the China of 2019.
Exactly.
So, I mean, you're right. Everything's changing. And President Hassan is really going in a different direction. So it's going to be interesting. Let's close our discussion with some predictions. I don't usually like to do this because it's a fool's errand, but nonetheless, I'm going to do it today. So before we go, Thabit and Muhidin, where are we going to be in 6 or 9 months from now on this deal? So Thabit, let's start with you, and then Muhidin will go to you.
I think where we're going to be in the next 9 months, I think we'll see that, we'll see negotiations back on track. How much ground will the negotiators cover? That remains to be seen. But I think will be some serious negotiations going back. I think between the question is whether, again, the Omani and the Chinese is still very much part of the deal. That's another question. But I think we'll see negotiations back on track. And I think President Samia will build on this, Muhidin has talked about this, again, very improving relationship between CCM and the CCP, and also China and Tanzania. But I don't expect anything substantial in terms of maybe a memorandum of understanding or and a paperwork signed in the next 9 months. I don't expect that, but I expect a lot of high-level negotiation to revive the project.
And Muhidin, give us your take on what you think is going to happen.
I think we might have something tangible after 9 months because from what I understand is that the Chinese have always maintained their interest in the project. And this is an ideal opportunity because Tanzania has already shown sort of like interest in the project, the Tanzanian government. So it's a window of opportunity that it has to be exploited by, I think the Chinese understand this, but also there's a sense of agency on the Tanzanian side. So it's like both parties have mutual interest, and therefore I think they're going to iron out their differences like really soon, but the nature of the project might change in terms of probably maybe like downsizing the project and probably focus on specific aspects of the project rather than the original idea. But I think that something tangible might come up in the next few months.
Okay, we'll follow up with you in 9 months to see what's going on. I want to thank you both for taking the time to join us and really to help us better understand it. I started this conversation with a lot of gaps, and I feel like I have a much better understanding it. Muhidin Shangwe is a lecturer in the political science department at the University of Dar Salaam in Tanzania, and Thabit Jacob is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Political Science at the University of Gothenberg in Sweden. Both of you are active on Twitter and post some really insightful stuff. Thabit, let's start with you. If people want to follow what you're reading and writing these days and some of your thoughts on these issues, where can they find you on Twitter?
Yeah, so I tweet at Thabit Senior, and there you can find a lot of geopolitical energy and Belt and Red stuff. And I tweet a lot about broader political economy and Tanzania and food and so much more.
Fantastic. And Muhidin, how about you?
I'm on Twitter, Shangweli Beria at Shangweli Beria. Unfortunately, fortunately, I tweet in Kiswahili and English, and it's a mixture of stuff. Like I tweet about China, Africa, China, Tanzania, but also other anything political, domestically, regionally, and internationally as well.
And I will put links to both of their Twitter accounts in the show notes that you can find it and connect with them directly. Thank you both for taking the time. It was great to talk with you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Eric.
Cobus, I am so glad that we had Thabit Muhidin to come on to really flesh out what we have been reading about in the papers for a long time. But again, there's a lot of gaps in this story, and people are assigning their own narratives on top of it. So we heard about the pushback on the Belt and Road. We heard about Magufuli, doing, really being angry with the Chinese. And what was the most interesting takeaway for me was how, again, over and over and over again, we see this play out in Africa. How domestic politics are driving a lot of these decisions with the Chinese. And in many ways, the Chinese are secondary actors. So Magufuli, this might have been about pushing back on Kikwete. I mean, this had nothing to do with the Chinese. Sure, it had something to do with the Chinese, but it might have been domestically driven initially far more than it was with the Chinese. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of outsiders fail to take into account when they see a lot of these big deals implode or run into problems, the role of domestic politics.
Yeah, I agree. It's really important to factor that in. At the same time, not only the domestic politics, but also domestic development plans, and the way that they kind of intersect with politics. So I think that's really interesting. It was very interesting to hear them kind of laying out all of the different kind of sections of the plan and all of these different ways that they're supposed to be intersecting. Those kind of development plans, I think, frequently also don't get enough enough like airtime, kind of in international discussions of it, and which is frequently framed in terms of China pushing to set up this kind of infrastructure, whereas in reality it's very frequently being driven by kind of some kind of national plan for economic development.
Yeah. So a couple key points here. If this is going to be financed by the policy banks, I think it's a dead-on-arrival project. I just don't think that the policy banks have the stomach for this. We've spoken about this really all throughout the year, about the dramatic fall in lending by the Chinese policy banks. It just played out recently in Nigeria, where the Nigerian government has more or less given up on $14.4 or $14.5 billion worth of railway loans from the Chinese, and they moved on to talk to Standard Chartered, who incidentally is also financing part of the Tanzanian standard gauge railway. So if this is a policy bank loan-driven project, we just aren't seeing those kind of deals anymore in Africa because the feasibility is very difficult. And they got so burned on what happened in Kenya with the standard gauge railway there, I just don't get the sense that they want to spend a huge amount of money. Now, this might be China Merchant Holdings funding this themselves without the policy banks. And in that case, if it's a business, an investment deal led by a state-owned enterprise, but not involving the policy banks, sure, that may have a chance, but probably in a much more scaled down fashion, as you pointed out. Let's just kind of close out this conversation on, again, the moment that we're in right now. We're looking at major setbacks in economic growth, the polemic kind of warnings that we're getting from the IMF and the World Bank and Vera Songwe at the United Nations about the impact that COVID-19 is going to have on African economies is terrifying. And so do you think this kind of project even makes sense in this moment, or should it be shelved? If you were advising the president in Tanzania, would you say wait for another day? Or given the fact that political considerations, as we heard from Thabit, might be driving this as well. So what do you think is going on?
Well, if I were, kind of advising the president of Tanzania, I think Tanzania would be in trouble. But I can well see that the COVID crisis may well add more fuel to the drive to push through these kind of big projects, because there is such everyone's hair is on fire in relation to this economic crisis. So I can well imagine that there would be sections in these different governments saying, like, now more than ever it's time to push even harder on these kind of development projects, because at least we need something that can pull us out, of the COVID crisis. So, I can well imagine that the COVID crisis ends up kind of generating arguments both in terms of escalation and de-escalation. And it's going to depend, I think, a lot on the kind of money that these governments can lay their hands on, and figures like Chinese lenders.
Well, let's leave our conversation there for the day. This is a topic that I suspect that in 6-9 months we are going to pick up again. By the way, if you go to our website at ChinaAfricaProject.com, type in the words Bagamoyo. We have been covering this going back all the way to 2019 and putting links that go all the way back to 2013. So if you're researching this, our website is a valuable resource, both for the analysis that Cobus and I are doing, but also for the links that we have to all the primary source and the news coverage coming out of Tanzania. So you'll want to check that out as well. While you're at the website, also do check out a subscription. You get 30 days for free to try out what we're putting out. We have a brand new China editor who's cranking stuff out every single day exclusive. We have a new Africa editor who will be starting in August. We're very excited about that. Cobus is writing columns, and I'm doing 8 to 10 stories a day. So if this is something that is of interest to you, you'll definitely want to check that out. Subscriptions start at just $7 a month. That's less than a cup of coffee in many American and European cities. So $7 a month for students and teachers, and $15 a month for everybody else. Just go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe, and you can sign up right there. So that'll do it for this edition. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode. Until then, for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/ChinaAfricaProject to share your thoughts on today's show. Or follow the guys on Twitter. Eric's at Eolanda, and you can find Cobus at Stadenesque. For more information about the China Africa Project and to sign up for our free weekly email news brief, go to ChinaAfricaProject.com.